Welcome to this video in which I will be outlining a number of ways in which theologians have tried to make sense of religious diversity. We will look at the spectrum of perspectives, also known as a typology, with the different types of approach, recognising that not only are people within one tradition, namely Christianity, trying to make sense of diversity outside of themselves, that is, the range of religious traditions, but that the types illuminate the very real diversity of perspective within a tradition. That is, different Christians have different views about religious diversity, which is obvious but worth stating explicitly. So what are the typologies for? They illuminate the field, that is, the spread of views when it comes to making sense of religious diversity. This field is sometimes called theology of religions, with each perspective being a theology of religions. But more recently, the term has been generally revised to theologies of religious diversity. We will note not only that there are different types of theology, but particular theologians have organised the range of views into slightly different typologies, obviously with things in common, but their different terminology helps to enhance our appreciation of various nuances and complexities. Basically, as we'll see, the field is multivalent, with a range of voices and insights, and rather fluid and complex. But even so, these typologies help us to map that complexity. You might have in your mind the question, do different typologies have different agendas? And if so, is that okay? So here's the spread of typologies that we're going to consider. Obviously not in every detail, but this table shows on the left the different theologians who have sought to organise the field into categories, and then from left to right we see the different names for the types and how they broadly overlap. I won't be touching on every nuance, this is the broad sweep to help us navigate the field more generally. So first, Alan Race, a British Anglican theologian whose three terms, devised in 1983, have been definitive in many ways. Exclusivism, there is only one religion that really does what needs to be done, or inclusivism, which is that one religion may in some respects include others, but on its own terms. And thirdly, pluralism, where each is valid on its own terms, in its own terms, though that wouldn't be how all pluralists would see it, as we'll see. I note as well Perry Schmidt-Leukel there, who applies a logical framework to affirm the logic of Race's typology. For Schmidt-Leukel, who speaks of what has the potential to save or liberate everyone as P, there are logically four positions. First, in atheism, P is given to no such religion, since they are all delusions, a position which Race doesn't address directly. Secondly, as in exclusivism, P is given only once to one religion. Thirdly, P is given to one religion intensely or maximally, but to others to some extent, inclusivism. And lastly, P is given many times, that is, to several religions, pluralism. Veli-Matti Karkkainen, who also sets out a threefold typology in explicitly Christian terms. So for him, exclusivism is ecclesiocentric, because salvation is only for those who explicitly confess faith in Christ, that is, the Church. Inclusivism is Christocentric, because Christ can have salvific or saving impact beyond the immediate life of the Church, or beyond those who explicitly believe in him, because the work of grace cannot be contained, but still has a centre point. Or thirdly, pluralism is theocentric, which is to say that God saves and uses many ways to do it. Though other pluralists would complexify that by saying that non-theistic traditions need to be part of the picture too. Paul Hedges, first with Alan Race, added an S to each type, recognising that each contains several slightly varied versions, so exclusivisms, inclusivisms, pluralisms. But then, unlike Race, he added a fourth category, particularities, which is roughly speaking to say that each tradition is so particular that it is not able to make judgments about other traditions, because they are doing different things. I'll say a little more about that shortly. And then Hedges made another distinction between types, which can look like rather neat theological positions, and tendencies, which he prefers, which acknowledge that we may not fit neatly into a type, but rather we are inclined in one direction or another, either to emphasise the discontinuity between one tradition and all others, or to emphasise that one is best suited to fulfil the partial effects of others, or that each may be properly open to the insights of others, or that radical difference between them makes such encounter and engagement somewhat problematic and even slightly out of reach. Here is the first type, again, in a couple of pictures. Exclusivism, only one way up the mountain, and other routes lead over the edge at some point, due to their untruth or incapacity. Or if we think of them as a Venn diagram, where U is the potential for universal salvation, and P is the particular tradition which pursues it. In this model, only one P, P1, is even inside universal salvation. The others are delusional and therefore outside. As we shall see again shortly, Adams calls these theologies of discontinuity, following Hedges, because of the clear gulf between one tradition and all others. Inclusivism, several roads can make it to the top, but only because, in effect, the whole mountain is graced by Christ. Even if some of the travellers don't know that, they are still implicitly saved, implicitly included, because of God's grace in Christ. Or different P's can participate in salvation because they are in some way in touch with the expansive grace which is effective through P1. Pluralism. Though notice I call it pluralism 1, or superficial pluralism, following the work of David Ray Griffin. In this model, there is basically one common goal, which the religions do in different ways, so each is valid in their own terms, each getting up the mountain in their own way, but the differences don't run so deep, they are relatively superficial, perhaps a matter of language or of culture, whereas what matters more is the commonality, the one mountain. You could say they are local variants of one big story, each a different P of the same U, or different chapters in the same book. Pluralism 2, on the other hand, or deep pluralism, sees the differences as running deeper. There may be certain traditions that have certain things in common with each other, like Islam and Judaism and Christianity, but others will be much more distinct, like theistic traditions on the one hand and non-theistic traditions on the other. So it's more like going up different mountains or having different U's in mind, where one P is well suited to achieving a certain U, but another U can only be achieved by a different P. And each will have many more things to learn from each other, since the diversity is greater. So the encounter goes deeper and we learn things more deeply. Particularities, or particularism, take that difference or distinctiveness to a further level, where it's not just that each is going up a different mountain or pursuing a different U, even if there is some overlap, but that the differences mean we're always talking at cross purposes with one another. We can't even be sure that when I speak of God, someone in another tradition means the same thing as I do. So all we can do is defer judgment and focus on being faithful to our own story. So that is the spread of options. Now we'll look at some other ways in which the typology and its options are expressed. Paul Knitter, an American Roman Catholic, uses different terms and splits some of the categories. So replacement theologies are the exclusivist ones because they seek the replacement of all other religions by one. Though some of these theologies may be total, there really is no room for other traditions, whereas some may be partial. God may find a way of reaching someone from another tradition in ways we cannot know or comprehend. For Knitter, inclusivist theologies are about fulfilment, where one tradition alone is capable of fulfilling what others can only do partially. Mutuality approaches emphasize that the different traditions are engaged in mutual activity, concerned with similar, or at least overlapping, goals, as in Pluralism 1, with some arguing this on philosophical grounds, like John Hick, for instance, who says that all the traditions are culturally conditioned responses to one transcendent reality. Some, on the other hand, argue it on mystical grounds, like Raimundo Panikkar. The traditions meet not at a mountaintop, if you like, but more mystically, as though different rivers meet and remain distinct but also intermingled. And some theologians argue this on ethical grounds, like Suchoski, all traditions pursue well-being, or Nitta himself, all pursue justice. But essentially, as with superficial pluralism, the differences between traditions do not run so deep, and therefore they are mutually pursuing similar goals. Whereas for Nitta, his acceptance model is about accepting the differences do run deeper, whether for the post-liberal particularists, who say we can't make judgments about others, or for comparativists, which is a particular commitment to trying to understand other traditions through disciplined comparison and dialogue. Or Mark Heim, for instance, whose model of the religions recognises them as having many ends or many salvations. For Gavin da Costa, another Catholic, exclusivisms are also split, but for him between restrictive access, where predestination has determined who gets to be a part of it, and on the other hand, universal access, where anyone can enjoy salvation as long as they go through one door. Inclusivisms are either structural, that is, the very structure of another religion can be blessed by the effects of God in Christ, which is what the Catholic Karl Rahner would say, or they are restrictivist, which regards other religions as only preparatory for the one that really matters. But this is really an exclusivism, as far as I can tell. Pluralisms, as with Knitta's mutuality model, can be split into three types. Unitary is one mountain, many paths, but pluriform is many mountains. And the ethical approach is to focus on common ethical goals between the traditions, as with Knitta above. Da Costa also distinguishes between different particularities, those focused on deconstruction, those of radical orthodoxy, which very much insists on getting on with being faithful to one's own story, though also somewhat presupposes its distinct uniqueness, arguably more like exclusivism, and comparativists, who are committed to the method of careful comparison, not making judgments. It's worth mentioning Velez da Cia, since he is Buddhist, so reworks the types so they can more easily be used beyond Christianity. Though we should note that other traditions have their own way of exploring the spread of options too. He suggests that each tradition must be free to identify its own X, its most important facet. So exclusivists are those who say only their X matters. Inclusivists are open to others' X, but only to the extent that others' X are comparable to our own X. Pluralists are those who are open to others' X where it may be comparable or not. But he adds a midway between those last two, pluralistic inclusivism, where we may be open to others' X, but with non-negotiable limits on the extent to which another X may differ from our own. I.e., it can be different, but only to this extent, determined by key doctrine. Adams, or me, I call them theologies of discontinuity, which focus on the key question of one religion's discontinuity over all others. Inclusivisms I call theologies of assimilation, since they assimilate other traditions into their own on their own terms. Pluralisms are essentially about receptivity, the capacity for one religion to be receptive to learn new insights from others, either superficially, where the differences don't run too deep, or deeply, where the strangeness of each is striking and illuminating, so there's more to learn. The last category I call theologies of deferral, where judgment is deferred, either because we cannot judge, or we bracket any preconceived judgments while engaging in careful dialogical practice. Here's the overall range of typologies again. Yes, well, most of these typologies are constructed by white Western men, interestingly, though not all, and not all Christian, and many of the people who engage with the debates are certainly not. But even so, the tendency to construct types is a rather Western project, related to the Western project of what has become known as the world religions paradigm. Rather neat categories of one neat religion making sense of other neat things called religions, a paradigm which increasingly is called into question. So you may well be left with lots of questions, quite apart from the fact that it may not have made complete sense. To an extent, the key thing is that there is this spread of perspectives, even within one tradition, each trying to make sense of religious diversity. But we might ask what these types and typologies achieve. Apart from mapping that range and its complexity, what do they miss out? How do they feel on the ground? What's going on when one religion, or people within one religion at least, try to make sense of other religions? But also, where are you in this? Do you warm to some approaches more than others? What other factors are there? What are your biases? Where next? And here are some resources.